so they can apply it to theirs and see, you know, hey, I'm in a similar position. Wow, Ryan, you're so right. Blah blah blah. I'm gonna have to do it in segments here. So this is gonna be the first video, and I'm titling it "What Makes a Man-Child?" Right? Is that what I said? Oh, how is the man-child formed? Okay, so very basic stuff. This is where all, like, most probably weak gamers will be similar to me. They will be similar. And so let me get started. Okay, so we're going to refer to my life to have a very good understanding of it, okay? And, all right. I started gaming at around the age of, well, I gamed before 6 years old, but like 4 or 5 probably. I was playing Sega Genesis, my brother's Sega Genesis. But when I was 6, I got a Nintendo 64. So I've been playing officially probably in 64 since I was 6 years old. I was hooked immediately. I have ADHD, right? So normally my brain has problems processing dopamine because of my ADHD. So it takes a little bit more dopamine for me to hold my interest. So naturally, video games were super high dopamine, and they were the only things that could hold my interest. Okay, and so I got hooked the game. So I started gaming, and that's what I did all the time. Growing up, I spent a lot of time with my mother. My father was always at work and would come home super late, and so I spent the majority of my time, a lot of my time, with my mother growing up. And so naturally, I would pick up on how my mother would act, okay, and how she would behave. And my mother is a very emotional person. She's very feminine, and she would communicate through emotion very well. My mother was very feminine, and so I grew up very feminine because I was constantly with my mother, which is not a bad thing. But it's bad if it's unbalanced. Okay, so every human has a feminine side to them and a masculine side to them. Okay, and if you want to attract very feminine women, then you need to reside by default on the masculine side. Okay, and so basically, as I grew up gaming and spending a lot of time with my mother, my mother would baby me and stuff and other things. I was kind of a mama's boy, and she would, I just kept gaming. But where it gets crazy is not so much in my early childhood too much, but as a child, you subconsciously you're supposed to learn from your parents, and you're supposed to get the masculine, the masculine side from the father, or so to speak, and then you can get your feminine side from your mother, or vice versa. It honestly doesn't. Gender does not matter. Sexual orientation does not matter. None of that stuff matters. It's all fine. Every person is always going to have a masculine and feminine side to them. Okay, always. And basically, what being feminine is affecting through emotion, is communicating primarily through emotion, and having the ability to affect others' emotions and make them feel a certain way. So whenever I go hang out with all my friends who are girls, they're very feminine chicks, and they constantly like to talk about, oh, I felt like this. Like, they're always constantly telling stories about, and they're always like really pinpointing how they felt about the story, like, really well. And then all the girls all immediately feel like the girl who's talking, who's telling the story, and she's pushed out those emotions towards all her girlfriends, and they're all talking back, pinging back the same emotions. Like, so if you get angry and you're telling an angry story, then they all get angry too. Like, they all are affected by those emotions too, and they all are the same. And so women are like the masters of emotion, kind of. They're meant to be for a reason, which I can get into later. And it's very beautiful in the process of what it's like to find a mate, and the role women play is extremely, extremely important. But like I said, all humans are supposed to have a masculine and feminine side to them. Now, what happened with me in particular is that I never developed any masculinity growing up, so I became an unbalanced person. Okay? And basically, growing up, I got to around 12, 13, near puberty almost. And at that time, I had been spending more time by myself, even though my father was available. I didn't spend enough time with him, and I instead played video games. And so, what's happening at 12 or 13 years old when I started playing video games? I started watching porn around 14 or something. So I grew up kind of feminine, which is fine, but I didn't really have any masculinity to balance it out. Okay, and you need both, because what masculinity is the ability to not be affected by emotion. That's all masculinity is, okay? Is you say a guy is super masculine, he's able to have emotions thrown at him, not reflect them back, but instead ground them out, and then use the conscious mind to see through emotion. Does that make sense? To not let it affect you. And every human, man or woman, gender, sexual orientation, does not matter, will develop these things to become a balanced human. And so you'll have a side of you that will be emotional and great, and then you'll have a side of you that can not be affected by emotion when you need to. And when I say not be affected, I don't mean like choose to not feel them or not justify them. I mean, the way you get stronger emotionally is by feeling emotion, not running away from it. Okay, that is very important. Most people don't understand that. So to develop the masculine side, from what I read in books and other things, you basically need to take on negative emotion head on. Like grieving, the grieving process. Mainly grieving and taking on negative emotions when it has affected your ego. Does that make sense? So when people tend to justify themselves, they say, well, oh, that wasn't me. That wasn't my fault. That was because of that. And it was them. They point the finger. Oh yeah, it was because of that, bro. And yeah, it's not me. And what they're doing when they're getting defensive like that is they're protecting their ego. They get a little pumped up and like, no. And they blame other people, and they're protecting their ego from taking damage. But what happens when you do that is you don't grow and you don't change as a person. You don't mature. And so the way to grow emotionally and to develop your masculine side or even your feminine side is you need to choose to feel emotion. And most people want to only feel good emotion, and they never want to feel bad emotion, when feeling bad emotion is just as important as feeling good emotion. Does that make sense? And so that's how you grow up a balanced human. It doesn't matter who your parents are, okay? Like, all of this stuff is transparent. It is, like I said, it's gender does not matter. You could be any gender that you want in the world, any sexual orientation. But when it comes to having a couple, two people, it doesn't matter. One will be more masculine by default, and one will reside in the feminine by default more so. And that, you ever look at relationships, you can start to notice it, and it's fine. It's just how relationships work. People by default reside in either the feminine or the masculine, based off of who they are. And so I grew up very feminine. I developed my feminine very, very well early on. I got a really good feel for emotion, being emotion, translating my emotion so other people could feel my emotion. And there's nothing wrong with that, okay? There's nothing wrong with that. People associate being emotional with being weak or something. That's fucking bullshit. Feeling emotion, whether it be happiness or negative feelings, is so important to being a balanced human. And that's what I'm getting into. So through my beginning of my early life, I grew up very feminine. I didn't develop my masculine side. But then what makes the man child is basically you start to pull yourself out of society more and more. And with gamers, what happens is they get addicted to games, okay? And when they do, they they're in their room all the time playing games. So what happens if you're in your room all the time and you're not outside? Playing basketball with your friends, or touch football in the street, or doing shit that I did as a kid growing up. What happens if you ignore that and you're not kind of going through phases of life where you fail and feel bad feelings, or you ignore your homework and you feel bad about that, but you play games to get your mind off it, so you choose to not feel those negative feelings about how you fucked up and weren't doing what you're supposed to? What happens when you constantly repress and avoid negative feelings all the time, and you just choose to play games instead to take your mind off of it, right? Well, that leads to a very, very fragile person. You can almost think of it as like a time machine. So basically, when I was 13, 14 years old, I constantly just used games to run away from bad emotions. It caused me to become stunted in my emotional growth. Does that make sense? And so basically, you're 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. You're growing up, you're in your 20s. And you've been doing the same thing. Some things may have changed. Maybe your mom doesn't baby you as much. Or maybe you go to work now and you consider that an adult thing. But all the while, you've been spending most of your time in your room avoiding life, avoiding negative feelings. You have grown very fragile. And what I mean by that is you're now 24, 25 years old. And you still have the same emotional strength that you did when you were 13 or 14. And so you're 24 or 25, and when you go up to a girl, you're acting like you're in middle school still. Hey, I really like you, and like I want to do stuff. And it's like you're on old software. You're on old emotional software, bro. Everybody else is 25, 26 years old. They're running on the up-to-date software. They have grown emotionally over the years by enduring failure and trials and tribulations. And you have been sitting around in your room avoiding all that shit, not growing, not building character. Does that make sense? And so now you now have what is called a man-child, okay? You have what appears to be an adult, but is extremely emotionally fragile like a child. That is what the man-child is somebody with emotionally stunted growth, still acting like a boy or girl. Oh, there's a woman child, there, everything else, whatever. You're acting like a young child. And so basically, it's like, well, then on top of that, because you've been so emotionally weak through the years, what happens with emotionally stunted people is they develop, because they're so fragile and so affected by emotion and stuff, they develop certain ways to try to support themselves emotionally. So the one thing that I picked up was people pleasing. And I would please people to make them like me because I hated myself in order to gain their approval. And I did it at the expense of my own self-respect. Does that make sense? I would disrespect myself to make sure other people liked me. Okay? And that's what happens with especially weak people. Sometimes gamers probably. I lived that. And so, as you grow up weaker and weaker and you sit in your room and start watching porn, and you never get to experience developing your social skills with people and women because you've been hiding all along. So you're lagging behind socially as well. People talk differently than they used to when you were 15 years old. They talk like adults now. And so like you're lagging behind on social standards. You are lagging behind on basically everything that you could imagine. Like your emotional strength, your social standards, how you think. You're still trying to game women like you're in middle school or high school, like handing them a note telling you you like them and shit. People are past that. That was 10 years ago. But yet you are still in this boat of, I need people to like me. Maybe you've developed this people pleaser kind of look. This is referring to me. Like I was a people pleaser. And so like I would constantly try to do the same thing to women that I did in my early 20s as I would do when I was 14, 13 years old. I would do like the same weird stuff. It was like no different. I was literally a man-child. Okay, does that make sense? And so you have to overcome that. And that, my friends, is basically how the man-child is formed is by not enduring life, avoiding social interaction, avoiding pain to their ego, avoiding grief, not accepting certain things about themselves, being very protective of their ego. So instead of justifying things, they say, hey, instead of like, they be like, oh no, that wasn't me, that was you, and they blame other people, or they always have an excuse. Well, it was because of this and blah blah blah. And that's what my friend would tell me growing up. He's like, Lockwood, you always got an excuse for everything. You never own up to anything. Because I would never own up to anything because I was so weak to accept that I was at fault. I couldn't accept weak things about myself because my ego was so fragile. And so that the only way to grow emotionally is that ego, that person you are, your ego, who you are and shit, that you developed at 13 or 14 years old and you haven't changed and you're still protecting that ego at 24, 25 years old. The only way to grow is to destroy it. Okay? You have to destroy your ego. You have to have an ego death. And the only way to do that is to feel pain. You feel pain, you will destroy your ego. And you have to take shots to your ego. So when people say, Lockwood, bro, you were fucking late. And what the hell's wrong with you? You got to be to work on time. And you go, you know what? You're right. You're right. I apologize. And you know what? You deal with that grief. You deal with that. You deal with fucking up and not holding up your responsibility. And you feel that pain and you let it sit. And that pain will sit. And then you'll feel it and it will eventually go away. And you develop a skill, a very important skill. And learning how to make yourself feel better. And this is the very start. Taking shots to your ego is how you learn the skill of being able to comfort yourself emotionally. Okay? It is very important. People will not do it. People will not do it. And they are so fucking fragile. It's insane. People who always have fucking excuses for fucking everything. They always fucking justify fucking everything. And so that's why I want to get into this to end this particular segment. Let me look for it. Okay, here. We have this right here. Desktop view. So we have bend and be straight. I learned this from a seminar and it's very dear to me because it is very, very important about how to live your life. And they say, so this woman, Amy, wrote a little article here, and she said, there's an ancient Chinese maxim, yield and overcome, bend and be straight. It reminds me of something the priest I used to work for would say. I heard it a few times during my first year of parish work. There would be occasions during staff meetings when we disagreed about something, and the brief discussion would end with him telling me to be a willow. He would then wisely explain how inflexible trees fall down in high wind, but willows bend and so they survive. Being more of an immature oak at the time, I always wanted to snap back with something snarky. If I bend like a willow, you might squash me flat. But the past decade has taught me a few lessons, and one is how good it feels to bend with the breeze. When the breeze becomes a storm, I'm already accustomed to bending. It doesn't hurt as much. When the storm is over, I stand straight again. Enjoy the excerpt below, the Tao Te Ching, written in China centuries before the birth of Christ. Though the words precede him in time, you will hear in them the echo of his voice and the wisdom of his followers. Bend and be straight, be a willow. When I am weak, then I am strong. And so the excerpt here, it goes, yield and overcome, bend and be straight, empty and be full, wear out and be new, have little and gain, have much and be confused. Therefore the wise embrace the one and set an example to all, not putting on a display they shine forth, not justifying themselves they are distinguished, not boasting they receive recognition, not bragging they never falter. They do not quarrel so no one quarrels with them. Therefore the ancients say, yield and overcome. Is that an empty saying? Be really whole and all things will come to you. And so That is amazing, man. This is so wise. You have no idea. And this is kind of what I live by. So when people have a weak ego, they simply need to yield and overcome. They need to yield to the fact that they truly are weak. And now people think they might yield, but they don't. They're still tricking themselves and protecting their ego. They don't want to feel that pain. But when you yield, say, you know what? I'm weak. I do argue a lot. I justify myself all the time. I make excuses all the time. I protect my ego a lot. I always got to make sure people know that I know everything. Oh, I'm a know-it-all. Oh, I know about that. Oh, I know about that too. When you slow down and stop supporting your weak ego and take hits to it, what you do is you just yield to reality and overcome that. And then you will bend for a little bit. You'll take those shots to your ego. But after you go through taking those hits and those emotional shots, you literally will bend back up straight like the willow tree again. You will be accustomed to feeling negative pain because you chose to feel it and become a stronger person. And when you choose to feel it, it won't bother you as much anymore. Is when you feel happy feelings from listening to music, you listen to the song over and over and over again. Do the happy feelings stay there the entire time? No, they go away. And the same thing happens for negative emotions. When you choose to feel them, they will affect you less and less and less, thus destroying the person you were, the ego you were, and you will now build upon and remold yourself as a human to take on stronger negative emotions and be able to step up and be someone in life. So for example, my advice to people is to stop justifying themselves to people. Stop fucking making excuses. Let that weird feeling in your chest, that weird feeling that your ego's been attacked, let it sit there. And just feel that pain. Let people think wrongly of you. Don't try to correct them. Let them think wrongly of you. It's very important to be able to be like, well, you care too much what people think. And it's just like, yeah, because your ego's so weak and you need that emotional support for it because you're so fragile. But when you learn to just feel negative emotions and maybe don't justify yourself all the fucking time, and just when people attack you, instead of fighting back with emotion, maybe sit there and say, I'm feeling this way right now, but Ryan Lockwood told me about this. And you say, you know what? I'm not going to react to that. I'm going to sit here and just feel this bad feeling for a second. And you'd be surprised at how practicing that kind of stuff consciously will help you grow as a person. And then you go on and take rejection when you talk to women or whatever, and you learn how to deal with those feelings, and then you find out more and more about yourself. When you become less and less affected by your emotions, you start to use your conscious mind more. And then it's almost like you can think more clearly because your weak emotions aren't weighing you down anymore, because you've chosen to feel negative pain and negative feelings, and now you're at a higher default level of happiness. You're more content and it's more consistent, because things that used to bother you don't bother you anymore, because you've dealt with that before. You felt that before. It doesn't affect you anymore. And that is the problem with man children, is they choose to stay in this comfort bubble of pornography, video games, and drugs, alcohol, whatever, and they never leave it because all they're feeling is a bunch of pleasure, and they have no idea how to go on and find real fulfillment, which I will also get into later. But it's very important to come out of your comfort bubble and start taking shots to your ego. And it's going to suck. Some people may cry. You may cry when it happens. And you may be fucking sad all the time. But I promise you, like, the pain will go away. It will go away. You will become stronger when you let your ego be shattered. And that's why the background on my computer will always be this. That's why I have it. Man cannot remake himself without suffering. for he is both the marble and the sculptor. You have to take shots at who you are. You have to let your ego be resculpted. You have to let that 13, 14-year-old fragile, emotional boy ego or young girl ego, whatever, be destroyed. And when it is, and you learn to take those shots, you literally remold yourself. And things that used to bother you don't anymore. And you're like, holy shit, I used to be a depressed person. And it's like, well, I'm not anymore. Like, I can't believe I used to be mad about those things. And then when you go through that kind of pain and you endure this pain, you start to love yourself even more and more. Does that make sense? You say, man, I've been through so much bullshit. And like, it's been like your own journey, just you. You're not sharing it with anybody else. And what happens is, by seeing how much pain you've gone through, you learn to love yourself more and appreciate who you are more because you dealt with that pain. You said, I'm fucking awesome. I can't believe I've been putting myself through this and like triumphing over it and just not stopping at improving myself. You know, yielding to reality. People tell me things about myself and I think about it and I go, you know, you're right. You know, you start to yield more and you let your ego get used to it and then it gets attacked and smashed down and you literally rebuild and resculpt yourself. So that is the man-child, how it is formed, and that is basically what somebody needs to do to jumpstart that process to getting their emotional software back up to date with everybody else who's at the proper age, 25, 26, 27 years old, whatever. And you have to learn to take shots to your ego. I can't tell you how many fucking people I've ever talked to, and they fucking claim that they take shots to their fucking ego, and they claim they've changed or something, and it's just like, no, you haven't. You'd be surprised at how many people think that they accept things about themselves, but they really don't. Now, but there's a fallacy to that, right? So it's like, well, am I just supposed to accept everything that people tell me about myself? It's like, well, you're this, Ryan, and I'm like, oh, you're right. No, that doesn't mean you have to do that. But instead of getting defensive immediately and arguing with them and like trying to protect your ego, maybe let that wrong thought that they threw at you, let that sit in the air for a little bit. Think about it and go, really think about it. Let it open to your ego and go, you know what? I don't think that's right. I disagree with you. And they'd be like, no. And I think this about you. Well, they think wrongly of me, and that's hurting my ego. But you go, you know what? You might think that about me. I disagree with you. And that's okay. And if you want to think that way, that's cool. And don't argue with them. Let them think badly about you. Let that, take that shot to your ego that somebody thinks wrongly of you. And then when you get used to that, man, you really don't give a fuck about what people think about you. You know what I mean? You really don't give a fuck at all what people think about you. It's fucking insane. It's incredible the emotional gains you'll make when you put some of this shit that I'm talking about to use. So, all in all, boys, that is the end of the first segment about how a man-child is formed and what to do about it to start breaking yourself out of that position as a man-child. And that'll be my first video. Thank you for listening to that first segment.